On this edition of Crime Chronicles, I come to you from the banks of the Tar River in Greenville, North Carolina. It's home of the East Carolina University Pirates, Purple and Gold, vinegar-based barbecue, and in the late 1990s, the scene of a bizarre crime which stretched across 3 states, North Carolina, Maryland, and Delaware. We take a look at the murder of Gary Wayne Thomas at the hands of George Kalomeris. We also talk to one of the investigators who worked the case. So stay tuned for this edition. The murder of Gary Wayne Thomas in Greenville, North Carolina is a convoluted story of identity theft, a horrifying psychopath named George Kalomeris, and a story that does not follow a neat timeline or trajectory. Gary Wayne Thomas was murdered by George Kalomeris in Greenville, North Carolina in the summer of 1996, but neither his body nor his killer will be discovered until many months later, and it will be discovered because of the murder of a man named Thomas Jones, not in North Carolina, but in Delaware. Our story starts not here in North Carolina, but in Milford, Delaware, at the home of 56-year-old Thomas Jones in 1997. Jones was a paraplegic confined to a wheelchair and lived by himself. One day, as he received a regular visit from a home health care worker, the health care worker discovered he was not there, which was unusual, and even worse, she discovered a trail of blood leading to his driveway. She phoned authorities, who launched a search for Jones. Miraculously, his body was found in a forest by aerial search. It turns out Jones had been shot in the back of the head and left there to die. Miraculously, Jones was not dead, and he was able to name his attacker. The shooter, was known to him, and it was a man he had known for many years, a friend of the family named George Kalomeris. Thomas Jones had visited the Kalomeris family home in Maryland off and on over the years. Although the two men had not seen each other in quite some time, Kalomeris knew that Jones lived alone, did not socialize much, was physically vulnerable, that he had invested a sum of money, and had a valuable coin collection. When George Kalomeris visited Thomas Jones at his home on August 13th, the visit did not surprise Jones, so he thought nothing of turning his back on Kalomeris. While sitting in his wheelchair, Jones was shot in the back of the head by George Kalomeris. Thinking Jones was dead, Kalomeris put him in the trunk of his car and dumped him in the woods, leaving him to die. Although Thomas Jones was able to tell police that it was Kalomeris who shot him, they did not know Kalomeris' motive nor where he was. Born in either 1955 or 1956, George Kalomeris grew up in the Washington, D.C. suburbs of Maryland, residing in the affluent suburb of Silver Spring by the mid-1990s. He was described as engaging, intelligent, and a charmer. His father, also named George, had worked as a police officer and as a teacher. The younger George Kalomeris thought regular, steady work was beneath him and was always in search of shortcuts. He made scrambling devices to outsmart cable TV systems, selling them to people who could use it to get cable TV for free with the device. But as cable companies developed the technology to make such devices useless, his skills were no longer in demand, and he had to find other ways of making money. Another key figure in this case was Nora Hagmeyer, or Nora Hagmeyer Kalomeris. She was 22 years old when she married George Kalomeris. And to demonstrate just how manipulative George Kalomeris could be, he was not exactly a prize catch, one would think. He was 13 years older than Nora Hagmeyer. He had no real legitimate employment prospects, but somehow he convinced Nora Hagmeyer's father that he would make a good husband for his daughter. And so they married, and that brought them to Greenville, North Carolina. The next phase of the George Kalomeris saga takes us to the campus of East Carolina University here in Greenville. That's where his wife Nora got a job as a sign language interpreter. After Nora got a job at East Carolina University as a sign language interpreter, they moved into the Trevick apartment complex in Greenville, located near East Carolina's medical school and the local hospital, and just down the road from Bees, the town's storied locally owned barbecue establishment.
The mascot for East Carolina University is the pirate. Now, unfortunately, pirates have been romanticized throughout the centuries when they were little more than just brigands and robbers and killers. But not even the lowest kind of pirate would have perpetrated the kind of crime that George Kalomeris inflicted on his victims. According to those who knew him, George Kalomeris was not exactly a hard worker, at least at honest work. And while his wife Nora was working as a sign language interpreter at East Carolina University, George Kalomeris spent most of his time hanging out in his apartment complex. And that's where he met Gary Wayne Thomas.
Upon moving to North Carolina, George Kalomeris still had no job and spent most of his time hanging around the apartment complex. In his early 40s, Gary Wayne Thomas was a troubled man from a wealthy family, the Thomas-Built Buses family, a High Point, North Carolina school bus company. But Gary Thomas's relationship with his wealthy family was fractured because of his substance abuse addiction. He had done several stints in rehab. Thomas's family had little contact with him, but Gary's grandfather set up a trust fund through a Greenville, North Carolina Wachovia bank branch that doled out monthly checks to Gary from $1,500 to $3,000 per month.
George Kalomeris had a knack for spotting weakness and vulnerability. Just as he had done with Thomas Jones in Delaware, he did with Gary Wayne Thomas. He discovered that Gary Wayne Thomas was pretty much a loner, was on the outs with his family, but that he had contact with them mainly in the form of a trust that paid him a check every month. He got to know every detail of Gary Wayne Thomas's life, and that's how he took advantage of him.
As he had done with Thomas Jones, George Kalomeris got close enough to Thomas to realize that he was emotionally and psychologically vulnerable, had few close personal ties to anyone including his family, and that he had access to considerable amounts of money without working. Gary Wayne Thomas told George Kalomeris about his family's wealth and the trust fund with Wachovia, even sharing birthday info about his family. The two men shared a fondness for marijuana, partying, and hiring hookers. Kalomeris' marriage to Nora being no deterrent to hiring sex workers. Around July 1996, the Thomas family started getting letters, ostensibly from Gary, saying he was in rehab, and that George Kalomeris had promised to take care of his affairs and possessions while he was in rehab. By the fall of that year, it appeared that Kalomeris was keeping his promise to pay Gary's bills, sending birthday cards to relatives, etc. Wachovia received letters, supposedly from Gary Thomas, saying he was doing well and asking for more money from his trust fund so he could buy a car and take a vacation.
Flash forward to the summer of 1997. By this time, George and Nora were living in Silver Springs, Maryland with Nora's parents, and they were making regular withdrawals from Gary Thomas's checking account via ATM.
Now living in Maryland with his wife and daughter, George Kalomeris was sending correspondence to Wachovia Bank in Greenville, but under Gary Thomas's name. The correspondence to Wachovia stated that Gary Thomas had moved to Maryland and that any trust funds be sent to Maryland rather than Greenville, North Carolina.
By the late fall of 1996, the Thomas family became concerned about Gary. Although they did not have regular contact and were not on the best of terms, they had not heard from him in quite some time, at least personally. They found it particularly strange when Gary's grandfather, who had set up his trust for him, passed away, and Gary did not come to the funeral.
Not having heard from him or seen Gary in months, in December 1996, the family of Gary Wayne Thomas contacted Wachovia Bank in Greenville and were told that the trust fund payments were still going out. By summer 1997, George and Nora Kalomeris were living with Nora's parents in Silver Spring, Maryland, and still making ATM withdrawals from Thomas's account. On August 13th, George drove 2 hours to Milford, Delaware, to visit Thomas Jones. Kalomeris asked Jones about his coin collection, finances, and investments. After shooting Thomas Jones in the back of the head, George Kalomeris took Jones's coins, financial documents, and his checkbook. Thinking the 56-year-old paraplegic farmer was dead, Kalomeris placed him in a truck and dumped him in the woods, where he would be discovered by police over 30 hours later. That night, George Kalomeris made the 2-hour drive back to Silver Spring, Maryland, put his daughter to bed, and went to sleep. Kalomeris soon received word that Jones was actually alive and had named him as the shooter.
Now George Kalomeris was on the run. He had officers in numerous states seeking his arrest.
Maryland police went to Nora's parents' home in Silver Spring, Maryland with a warrant. Nora made the dubious claim that she did not know where George was. Upon executing the search warrant at the Hagmeyer home, Maryland police looked for information regarding Thomas Jones and found nothing. But they found some checks written from Gary Wayne Thomas's account from Wachovia Bank in Greenville, North Carolina, having no idea who Gary Thomas was. Given the similarity in names, Maryland police initially thought that Thomas Jones and Gary Wayne Thomas might be the same person. Maryland police contacted the Wachovia branch in Greenville, North Carolina, and were told that no one had seen Gary Thomas in person for about a year. He had been reported missing. George Kalomeris was on the run, so by August 16, 1997, police were looking for George Kalomeris in connection with the Thomas Jones shooting, and they started to see a possible connection between George Kalomeris and a man reported missing in Greenville, North Carolina, Gary Wayne Thomas. The Wachovia branch in Greenville, North Carolina was contacted again and asked why correspondence was being sent to an address in Dickerson, Maryland, about an hour away from Silver Spring, where George was living. The Dickerson address belonged to a mechanic friend of George's who had been allowing George to pick up his mail there. When Maryland police visited the mechanic, whose business also operated as a chop shop for cutting and selling stolen vehicle parts, he told them that George had taken a wheelchair there and asked him to destroy it, but the chop shop mechanic refused.
Police in 3 states, Delaware, Maryland, and North Carolina, began to communicate with each other and piece things together. They discovered that Thomas Jones and Gary Wayne Thomas had quite a bit in common. Namely, they were alone and vulnerable.
Police in all 3 states, Delaware, Maryland, and North Carolina, communicated and realized that Gary Wayne Thomas and Thomas Jones had another thing in common. Both had access to money. Thomas Jones was in a Delaware hospital, and Gary Thomas of Greenville, North Carolina, was missing.
One question to be asked, but really can't be definitively answered due to liability concerns in this podcast, is how much did Nora know about what was going on here?
Police were unsure as to Nora Kalomeris' complicity or knowledge about the Jones shooting or Thomas's whereabouts, but decided to use her to find George. Nora kept saying she had not seen George. Rather than press Nora, Maryland police started following her. Upon conducting surveillance, they concluded she had been lying. She was in contact with George and was taking money from Gary Wayne Thomas's account from ATMs. Nora was at best covering for George and at worst was an accessory to his crimes. Police threatened to lock Nora up as an accessory, so she caved, agreeing to set up a meeting on August 20th in a grocery store parking lot in Montgomery County, Maryland. George Kalomeris was arrested at the meeting in front of Nora and charged with the attempted murder of Thomas Jones in Delaware.
Upon discovering that Thomas Jones was still alive, George Kalomeris decided to get rid of it, and the way to do that was to hire a hitman from inside the jail.
At the Montgomery County Detention Center, George Kalomeris approached Norman Ellis, who was incarcerated for a parole or probation violation resulting from a drug offense. George Kalomeris advised Ellis to do what he had done: find wealthy people, assume their identity, and steal from them. George Kalomeris asked Norman Ellis to find a hitman for him. Ellis spoke with police and told them what George had said. He agreed to work with them in exchange for their recommendation for early release. Maryland police told Norman Ellis to tell George Kalomeris that he had found a hitman. George gave Norman Ellis a map to locate the Delaware hospital where Thomas Jones was a patient. Ellis asked Kalomeris to send a $500 down payment to a P.O. box, which was set up by the police. On October 14, 1997, 5 $100 bills arrived in an envelope at the P.O. box, with the return address as Nora and George's Silver Spring, Maryland home. While incarcerated, George Kalomeris was still sending mail in Gary Thomas's name, indicating Gary Thomas was still alive. Maryland police came to High Point, North Carolina, and spoke with police there. They also talked with Gary Wayne Thomas's family, with police in Greenville, North Carolina, where Gary was residing, and with Wachovia Bank in Greenville. Gary Thomas's account was still active. Withdrawals were being made in Maryland. Maryland police observed Nora Kalomeris making ATM withdrawals there, including the $500 hitman funds.
Slowly but surely, the case came together, and all 3 states cooperated in the investigation of George Kalomeris. And then the case took a turn when Thomas Jones succumbed to his wounds and died in the hospital.
Thomas Jones died on September 13, 1998. Now, the charge was upgraded to murder. Nora Hagmeyer Kalomeris was charged with bank fraud, conspiracy to commit bank fraud, and money laundering. George Kalomeris wanted Nora out of jail so she could raise their daughter. Since the case crossed state lines and involved U.S. mail, it was moved to federal court. Police and prosecutors agreed not to seek prison time for Nora if she cooperated with the Jones and Thomas investigations. Cutting a deal to avoid the death penalty, George Kalomeris told it all. He had devised a long-range plan to kill Gary Thomas, assume his identity, and steal his money. He had stored the information on his computer, and a computer search indicated he had conducted proper research on the life of Gary Wayne Thomas. George Kalomeris explained the murder of Gary Wayne Thomas. The two men were living at the same Greenville apartment complex when they first met. Then they moved to different complexes. Gary Thomas had moved to a small apartment complex just down the road from Bee's Barbecue and about 2 miles from his former Traybrook residence. The back of Gary Thomas's new apartment was heavily wooded.
Police discovered that in July of 1996, Gary Thomas had invited George Kalomeris to his apartment complex and actually the wooded area behind the apartment to look at some marijuana plants he had grown. And that was when Kalomeris had his chance.
Just as he had done with Thomas Jones in Delaware, George shot Gary Wayne Thomas in the back of the head. Kalomeris removed Thomas's clothing, his ID, and possessions. As it was summer, he hoped the body would decompose quickly in the sweltering eastern North Carolina heat. Kalomeris returned to the woods later to find the body decomposed. He took Gary's skull back to his apartment, smashed it, and removed his teeth. Then he started sending fake correspondence in Gary's name to the Thomas family in High Point, North Carolina, and to the local Wachovia branch in Greenville. On November 13, 1998, George Kalomeris took law enforcement to the wooded area behind Thomas's former apartment. Gary's remains were discovered there.
What was George Kalomeris' motive? The answer is simple: pure greed.
George Kalomeris stole about $22,000 from Gary Wayne Thomas, and he also stole from Thomas Jones.
We're here with retired Detective Ricky Best of Greenville, North Carolina Police Department. And Detective Best was one of the detectives, at least here in North Carolina, that helped crack this case. So just going to ask him a few questions and let him tell us what he knows. Start off, Ricky, where was the apartment complex where these two guys got together or met or whatever?
The last apartment complex was directly behind us. They met actually at Traybrook Apartments, which is just right around the corner.
This is the apartment where George Kalomeris lived and where he chopped up the remains of Gary Wayne Thomas.
Now, I've read and seen some documentaries about this, some including you, by the way, feature you, by the way. But did George or his wife, Nora, have a criminal record before this?
Yeah, George has just gotten out of prison for murder in Maryland.
And that was not mentioned. I forgot what show you were profiled on, one of those docudrama type shows.
There was two. We recorded this on 2 occasions, but I don't know that it ever came up, to qualify him as a serial murderer, more than 2 bodies, and he had 3. So,
and so it was one North Carolina, one in Delaware. Where was the one you're talking about?
In Maryland.
In Maryland.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so 3 states involved here, at least at this point. Plus, 3 states get involved in jurisdictional issues here too as well. So,
all right.
Ricky, one thing I wasn't sure about after hearing about this was that I believe he is incarcerated or he died while he was in prison in Delaware. I'm not sure. But what jurisdiction was involved here and why? Because there were 3 states. There was Maryland, Delaware, and North Carolina. What jurisdiction actually convicted him and imprisoned him?
Well, Maryland actually did most of the work. When it all started way back when I told you about, they found a bag of mail in a search warrant that they did on another case. And the mail turned out to be Gary Wayne Thomas's mail. That's what sparked them to start looking for Gary Wayne Thomas.
But wasn't there a guy in Maryland who he had, Kalomeris had his mail sent to, I believe?
That was the chop shop. That was the chop shop. The chop shop is where all the thugs hung out at, and that's where the mail was sent to. And when they raided the chop shop, they found a great big bag of mail of Gary Wayne Thomas, and that's when they started looking for Gary Wayne Thomas.
And that's why it became a federal case, correct?
No.
The mail? No.
Well, yeah, the mail made it become a federal case, but in order to get it a federal case, multiple states, anytime you cross the state line, it becomes a federal case.
You interacted face to face with George Kalomeris a lot.
On many occasions.
How would you? This is something, for whatever perverse reason, people like me want to know. People watching this want to know. How would you describe his manner, his personality? I mean, was he Was he pleasant? Was he arrogant? How would you describe him overall?
Very intelligent. He, in fact, he was so intelligent it was very difficult to carry on a conversation with him.
Now, what do you mean by that? Because
He on the many occasions that we traveled, because we transported him several different places, trying to carry on a normal conversation like you and I would have was very difficult, because he was just so intelligent that he was very difficult to talk to.
a number of people who carry out deeds like this. Now, some of the kind of person you don't walk to the water cooler with. They creep you out right away. But somehow I get the impression this was not him. He was maybe, charming or just engaging or what?
The word would be manipulative. I mean, let's face it, he convinced a local car dealer to sign off on a title of the car that Gary Wayne Thomas had, and Gary Wayne Thomas wasn't there, which is against the law.
So this is the kind of guy that could, no disrespect against car salesmen, this is the kind of guy that would be a good car salesman.
Absolutely would.
Any kind of
Oh, absolutely. In fact, that's why their business, they had a side business of cable boxes.
Yeah.
And these cable boxes you could hook up to your TV.
The people watching this now may not really know what we're talking about. Stealing cable TV.
Yeah.
I remember that. You remember that.
Oh, yeah.
That really does not exist anymore. But
Yeah.
How did that work? These guys did that?
Well, back then when you got cable, they would give you these boxes to hook into your TV so that you could get all the cable channels. And they would go in the cable boxes and put some kind of chip inside of it that would allow you to get all the channels. In other words, when you would buy probably 10 channels, with that chip, you could get all the channels. And in addition to that, they come up with a chip that goes in your satellite outside. And so you could put this in your satellite and get anything you wanted to get.
There's kind of a wink and nod attitude toward that. I mean, a lot of people did. It was illegal, but a lot of people did that.
A lot of people did.
But that business went out of business when
technology
changed.
Exactly. Technology took care of all that problem.
Now, Ricky, another thing I think people kind of like to know, and neither one of us are mental health experts. I'm not a psychologist or a psychiatrist. I don't have a therapeutic background. I guess the same applies to you. But an off-the-cuff layman's personality, layman's assessment, I should say. Would you describe this guy as having any kind of mental health issues, or was he just simply an antisocial personality or a psychopath?
I think he's a psychopath. And I mean, you think about it. He kills the man in the woods. He waits for him to decay. He goes out and gets his bones. He breaks them up. I mean, you tell me what kind of man does that.
Well, you dealt with people in your line of work that were clearly mentally ill at times. I mean, they're raving drunk and all that.
No, he's not.
But this guy, though, had all his faculties in order.
Absolutely.
He simply had no capacity to care for other people's problems or needs or pain. Right?
He just didn't want to work for a living. He wanted to live off of somebody else.
They say that envy is one of the 7 deadly sins. Did it kind of begin there with him, or was that part of his problem, or just lazy? Or sloth is also a 7 deadly sin. So.
In the very beginning, when he met Gary Wayne Thomas at Traybrook Apartments around the corner, he developed a computer program on Gary Wayne Thomas. He learned everything about him. His sock size, his shoe size, his birthdays, his mama's birthday, his daddy's birthday, their anniversary. I mean, everything he could garner from talking to Gary. He put it in this computer program. He even had the dates of birthdays for the mother and the father and that kind of thing, where he would send, he knew Gary always sent a card to his parents for their birthday and stuff. And so he actually bought cards and sent them to him after he killed him, so that they wouldn't raise any suspicion that he wasn't anywhere to be found. And so he would actually send them greeting cards.
All right, well, thanks, Ricky, for your time. I'm sure the viewers will enjoy it.
You're welcome.
George Kalomeris was sentenced to 395 years in prison and died in a Delaware prison in 2015 from a heart attack. Nora Kalomeris was sentenced to 6 months house arrest. Well, I hope you enjoyed this edition of Crime Chronicles. As we delve into the darker side of human nature, we invite you to join us on our journey by liking and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Your support helps make possible our inquiry into the sometimes unsettling but always fascinating phenomenon known as crime and justice. So hit that like and subscribe button right now
and don't miss future episodes. Till then, Mark Jones, hoping you will join our Crime Chronicles community. And thanks for tuning in.